I want you to close your eyes for a second. We are going to do a little time travel today. We're going back to 1985.
Oh, wow. The Dark Ages.
Right. So you are sitting at a desk. It's probably made of that really heavy particle board with a fake wood laminate that's starting to peel up at the corners. And sitting right in front of you is a beige box, a massive, heavy, humming beige box.
The fan noise alone on those things is just iconic. That low, constant, grinding drone.
Exactly. And you have a task to do. Let's say you just want to open a spreadsheet, just a very simple grid of numbers. Or maybe you want to write a letter in a word processor. So what do you do? Because you don't just click an icon on a screen.
Oh, no. You have to physically reach for a plastic box on your desk.
Yeah, you flip through it, you're thumbing through these paper sleeves until you find a square, very flexible 5¼ inch disc.
The floppy disk. The absolute, undisputed ruler of the computing world at the time.
You pull it out of its sleeve, you slide it into the drive bay, you turn that little plastic lever, and you get that really satisfying clump to lock it in place. And then the noise starts.
Oh, I can hear it now.
That grinding, mechanical gurgle.
Right, it's the sound of a stepper motor just desperately trying to find track 0 on the magnetic film. And then you wait.
I just stare at a blinking green cursor.
Yeah. And then, maybe 30 seconds later, the screen flashes a message that says, insert disk 2.
The famous floppy shuffle.
It was a lifestyle. I mean, it wasn't just a nuisance. It was the defining physical ritual of using a computer. You were essentially a DJ, but instead of spinning records to keep a party going, you were swapping magnetic disks just to get a basic spell checker to load up.
And we just accepted it. We lived our entire digital lives in these tiny 360 kilobyte chunks. I mean, if you were lucky, maybe you had the high-density ones at, 1.2 megabytes?
Yeah, 1.2 if you were really cutting edge.
Yeah.
But mostly it was just a world of total scarcity.
That's the perfect word for it. Scarcity.
Digital space was incredibly expensive, it was fragile, and it was small. If you dropped a floppy disk on the floor, you might lose a week's worth of work. If you put it too close to a magnet or even a telephone, sometimes you lost everything. We were just completely starving for space.
And that is exactly why the document we are looking at for today's deep dive is so explosive. It's an article from a magazine called Personal Computer World, and it's dated 1985. It's written by a tech journalist named Paul Groves, and the title of this thing is deceptively boring. It's just called Record Storage.
That is some classic British understatement right there.
Yeah.
Because the actual content of this article, it is like reading a report about alien technology crashing in a cornfield.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack this source material. We want to look at exactly what was happening in 1985 because Groves is reporting on these wild rumors coming out of Japan. He's talking about a quote-unquote quantum jump in storage capacity.
And he's not talking about an extra 360 kilobytes. He's not talking about a slightly better floppy disk.
No. He is reporting on a brand new optical format that can hold 540 megabytes on a single disk.
We really have to pause on that number.
Yeah.
540 megabytes. Because to a computer user in 1985, that number didn't even parse. It literally sounded like a typo.
Right.
It's like telling someone in the 1800s that you built a horse-drawn wagon that can travel to the moon. It was an order of magnitude jump that simply shouldn't have been physically possible.
So to put that in perspective, 540 megabytes is roughly equivalent to, 1,500 floppy disks?
Give or take, yeah. So I want you to imagine a stack of floppy disks reaching from your desk all the way to the ceiling. Now imagine shrinking that entire ceiling-high stack into a single shiny rainbow-colored circle that just fits right in the palm of your hand. That is the massive scale of the disruption we are talking about today.
And so in this deep dive, we are going to unpack exactly how that miracle happened, because we aren't just here to reminisce about, remember when computers were slow and clunky. We are going to look at the specific engineering challenges that made the CD-ROM possible. Because, as Groves points out in the article, this wasn't originally a computer technology at all, was it?
No, not even slightly. The computer industry essentially hijacked a high-fidelity music format to save itself from this storage crisis.
We're going to get into the raw physics of it, the difference between dragging a sharp needle through a physical groove versus shooting a laser beam at a microscopic bump. We're also going to look at the interface wars, specifically between Sony and Philips, and the exact hardware chips they used.
And we absolutely have to talk about the economics. The sheer, ridiculous financial gamble of trying to sell a drive that costs as much as a used car.
Right. So let's start with the atmosphere that Groves describes in the piece. He mentions visiting Japan and finding the entire tech industry, quote, awash with excited rumors. It really feels like he's describing a gold rush.
Well, because it was a gold rush.
Yeah.
You have to remember the context. In 1985, personal computing was hitting a very hard wall. Software was getting more complex, developers wanted to do more, but the storage just wasn't keeping up.
Yeah, you couldn't make a bigger program because you couldn't ask a user to sit there and swap out 50 floppy disks just to install a piece of software.
Exactly. They were desperate for a way out of this bottleneck.
And then, suddenly, the compact disc appears on the horizon. Now, Groves does this really beautiful comparison in the article that I want to highlight. He contrasts the old world of recording with this new optical world.
This is actually one of my favorite parts of the whole piece. He really grounds the reader in the physical, tactile reality of what came before. He talks about conventional records going all the way back to wax cylinders and then vinyl LPs.
Right, he literally lists the materials used for the stylus. He says they used thorn or steel, diamond or sapphire.
Thorn or steel. That specific phrase really stuck with me when reading this. It reminds you just how primitive the core concept of recording sound actually was for over a century. It was an inherently violent process.
Violent? How do you mean?
Well, absolutely violent on a microscopic scale. Think about what a record player is doing. You have a physical groove carved into a wall of vinyl, and you are dragging a rock, a diamond, or a piece of sharpened metal forcefully through that groove.
Oh, I see.
The only way you get sound out of that system is by friction. The modulation of the groove physically shakes the needle, which moves a tiny magnet, which creates an electrical current. But that physical friction means heat. It means wear and tear. Every single time you played a record, you were actually destroying it a little bit.
You were literally shaving off the high-fidelity frequencies every time you listened to your favorite song.
Exactly. It was an analog process of constant physical degradation. And then Groves completely pivots to the compact disc, and he describes it as a purely digital process.
There is no contact. There is no friction.
Right. No thorns, no steel, just light. The CD uses an optical laser system to read the surface of the disc. And the physical landscape of that disc is completely alien compared to a record. It's not a wavy, continuous groove. It's a single spiral track comprised of what he calls non-reflecting bumps, combined with areas of completely smooth disc surface.
Bumps and smooth patches. So this is basically the physical manifestation of binary language, right?
It is. It's beautiful in its simplicity. The laser shines onto the spinning disc. If it hits a smooth patch, which engineers call a land, the light reflects straight back into a sensor. If it hits a bump, which they call a pit, the reflection is scattered away and the sensor just sees darkness, light, dark, on, off, 1, 0.
But the physical scale of this Groves drops some stats in the article that are just wild. He says the tracks are less than a micron wide.
A micron, which is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. To give you a real-world sense of scale, a standard human hair is about 75 microns wide.
Wow.
So that means you could fit 75 separate CD tracks side by side on a single strand of your hair.
That is just absurd to think about.
It really is. It's a level of precision engineering that everyday consumers had never, ever been exposed to before. I mean, think about a floppy drive. The read-write head is this big, clunky magnetic block. It's highly mechanical, it's clumsy. But here, we are dealing with actual wavelengths of light and microscopic topography. Groves even notes that the bumps on the CD are roughly the exact same size as the wavelength of the laser light being used to read them.
Which means if your calibration is off by even a tiny fraction of a hair's width, all your data is just gone.
Completely gone. The mechanical precision required to spin a plastic disc at up to 500 RPM and keep a tiny laser perfectly focused on a track that is 1/75th the width of a hair? Honestly, it's a miracle it ever worked outside a laboratory.
But it did work, and because it worked so well, they suddenly had this massive, unprecedented amount of space. Now, Groves breaks down the math in the article of why a CD holds exactly 540 megabytes. And I love this part because he explains that this massive capacity wasn't actually decided by computer engineers at all. It was dictated by audio engineers.
Right. This is crucial context for understanding the whole medium. The CD was built from the ground up for music. Specifically, the urban legend goes that the CEO of Sony, Norio Oga, demanded that the new disc format had to be able to hold the entirety of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony without forcing the listener to get up and flip the disc over.
So that's about 74 minutes of continuous audio.
Exactly. That one specific requirement, Beethoven's Ninth, dictated the physical size of the disc and the density of the data pits.
Let's get into what Groves calls the sampling math. I want to walk through this because I think a lot of people hear the phrase digital audio, but they don't actually know what it means under the hood. How do you actually turn a sound wave into a series of numbers?
Okay, let's unpack it. Imagine a sound wave in the air. If you draw it, it's a smooth flowing curve, right? It represents continuous changes in air pressure. To turn that smooth curve into digital numbers, you have to take discrete snapshots of that line.
Kind of like how a movie camera takes individual frames of a moving image.
That is the perfect analogy. If you take enough rapid-fire snapshots, or what we call samples, you can connect the dots later and recreate the original smooth curve. Now, Groves alludes to a very fundamental rule in signal processing called the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem.
Okay, and what does that theorem state?
It states that if you want to capture a specific frequency perfectly, you have to sample it at a rate that is at least twice as fast as the frequency itself.
All right, so what was the target frequency for high-fidelity music?
Well, standard human hearing generally tops out at around 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. But for practical hi-fi purposes in the early 80s, and to allow for some electronic filtering headroom so things didn't sound harsh, they focused on capturing a usable range up to about 15,000 to 20,000 hertz. Groves simplifies it a little bit in the article, and he just mentions 15 kilohertz as the benchmark for high fidelity.
So following the rule, if you want to perfectly capture 15 kilohertz of sound, you need double that in your sampling rate.
Right. And through some very complex math related to videotape formats that they used for early digital recording, they eventually settled on a standard sampling rate of 44,100 times per second, 44.1 kilohertz.
Wait. 44,100 times a second.
Yes. The laser and the circuitry are taking a highly precise measurement of the audio waveform, 44,100 times every single second.
That just seems, I don't know, it seems excessive.
It sounds excessive, but it's absolutely necessary if you want the playback to sound like actual music and not like a jagged, robotic, pixelated mess. And here is where the math really gets scary. Groves does the calculation right there in the article to show where all the massive storage space goes.
Walk us through his math.
Okay, so you want an hour of music. Let's stick to Groves' 60-minute example just for simplicity's sake. So 60 minutes times 60 seconds is 3,600 seconds of audio.
Okay, 3,600 seconds. Got it.
Now, multiply those 3,600 seconds by the sampling rate. Let's use Groves' slightly rounded figure of 30,000 samples per second. Again, in reality, it's 44.1 K, which makes the final number even bigger. But using his conservative math, 3,600 seconds times 30,000 samples gives you 108 million individual samples.
108 million individual microscopic moments of sound.
But wait, there's more. We listen to music in stereo, right?
Yeah.
We have a left ear and a right ear, so you have to double that number. Now we are suddenly at 216 million samples for an hour of audio.
And each one of those samples isn't just a simple one or a zero. It has to tell the amplifier exactly how loud that specific microscopic moment is.
Precisely. That's what we call the bit depth. The CD standard uses 16 bits, which is exactly 2 bytes for every single sample. That gives you 65,536 possible distinct volume levels for every single snapshot.
Okay, so doing the math, 216 million samples times 2 bytes each.
Yeah, you are suddenly sitting on well over 400 million bytes of raw data. And then when you start adding in the error correction code, the synchronization bytes so the laser doesn't get lost, the tracking headers, boom, you easily hit that 540 to 600 megabyte figure.
It's incredible. The number 540 megabytes wasn't some arbitrary pie-in-the-sky goal set by a computer scientist trying to build a bigger hard drive. It was literally just the sheer mathematical weight of uncompressed high-fidelity sound.
And that's exactly what happened. The computer industry looked at this massive empty bucket that Sony and Philips had spent billions building just so people could listen to Beethoven. And the PC guys said, hey, if we don't put music in those tiny pits, we can put a whole lot of spreadsheets in there.
It was essentially a happy accident. The audio industry footed the bill for the billions of dollars in R&D to figure out how to mass-produce these complex lasers, and the computer industry just kind of hitched a ride.
It was the ultimate free ride in tech history.
Which brings us to the hardware itself. Groves transitions into a sort of hardware review mode in this middle section of the article. He talks about the specific physical drives that were coming out from Sony and Philips. And there is one particular detail about the Sony drive that I think is just a brilliant mix of marketing and engineering.
You're talking about the physical form factor of the drive.
Yes, the form factor. Sony proudly announced that its new CD-ROM player would occupy exactly the same physical space as a standard 5.25-inch floppy disk drive.
Now that sounds totally trivial to us today, right?
Yeah.
Because we used to standardize drive bays in our PC cases. But in 1985, this was a massive strategic masterstroke. By making the CD-ROM drive the exact same dimensions, and this is the really critical detail, placing the metal mounting screw holes in the exact same physical locations on the side of the drive, Sony made it incredibly easy for PC manufacturers and even home hobbyists to retrofit their existing machines.
It completely removed the friction of adoption. You didn't need to go out and buy a special Sony-branded computer tower. You just opened up your IBM clone, pulled out your dusty second floppy drive, and you just slid the future right into the exact same slot.
Exactly. If they had made it a weird external box or some proprietary shape, it very likely might have remained a niche, expensive product for laboratories. But by making it fit into the literal existing hole in the consumer's desk, they made its adoption almost inevitable.
But while the physical size was nicely standardized, the electronics inside were turning into a bit of a battlefield. We see the start of an interface war happening here.
Oh, the interface wars. It's such a classic tech industry trope. It's like VHS versus Betamax, or Blu-ray versus HD DVD. But here, it was Sony versus Philips arguing over the best way for the drive to actually talk to the computer.
Groves dives pretty deep into the technical specs here. He says Philips opted for what they called a serial interface. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. Think of a serial interface, like a single-lane country road. The data cars have to drive one right after another, one bit, then the next bit, then the next. It's a very simple design. The physical cabling is thin, usually just a few wires. It's elegant and cheap to make, but it has a very strict speed limit because everything is single file.
And what did Sony do?
Sony looked at that single-lane road and said, no, this is 540 megabytes. We need a highway. So they built a parallel interface.
Which I assume means adding more lanes.
Right. 8 lanes, to be precise. They use 8 bidirectional data lines. That means they could send 8 DITs, which is a full byte of data, all at the exact same time, marching side by side.
So Sony's approach is clearly built for speed.
Speed and robustness, yes. But here is the specific detail in Groves' article that I just absolutely loved. He starts geeking out about the actual microchips that Sony used to build this data highway. He specifically lists them out. 74 LS14s and 74 LS125s.
I saw those numbers in the source notes, and honestly, to most people, that just looks like a random string of serial numbers. But you were smiling when you read it. Why do those specific chip numbers matter so much?
Because for anyone who tinkered with electronics or built kits in the 70s or 80s, those are legendary chips. They are what Groves calls common or garden TTL buffers. TTL stands for transistor logic.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they were the absolute basic Lego bricks of the electronics world. They were dirt cheap. You could literally walk into a Radio Shack and buy a handful of them for pennies. They were highly reliable, very simple logic gates. Nothing fancy at all.
Wait. So you have this incredibly futuristic laser drive, this, quote, alien technology capable of holding an entire encyclopedia, and to hook it up to your standard PC, Sony used the electronic equivalent of duct tape and standard hardware store screws.
Yes. That's the genius of it. It meant that the barrier to entry for building interface cards was incredibly low. You didn't need some custom-fabbed, million-dollar proprietary silicon chip to get your computer to talk to the CD drive. You just needed a handful of 50-cent parts. It completely democratized the hardware connection.
And the software language they used to talk to the drive, Groves lists the command code set in the article. It wasn't some highly encrypted, complex military protocol.
No, it was incredibly polite and trivially simple to program for.
Give us an example of how it worked.
Okay, so imagine you are the computer's processor. You want the CD drive to find a specific spot on the disk. You just send the hexadecimal code A0 down the wire.
Just A0, that's it.
That's it. A0 just means seek. It essentially tells the drive, hey, go look for this specific block of data.
And if I want to actually read the data?
You send A8. That means read continuous.
And if I want it to stop?
A0, which just means break. Stop what you're doing.
It's almost like talking to a well-trained dog. You know, sit, fetch, stay.
It really is that basic. It proves that the engineers hid all the terrifying complexity, the laser tracking, the error correction, the motor speed inside the optical head, and the firmware. The actual outward-facing communication with the PC was designed to be as straightforward as humanly possible. They explicitly didn't want the interface to become a bottleneck for programmers.
There's also a fascinating mention of the header structure in the article, because if you think about it, on a cassette tape, finding a specific piece of data is really hard. You have to fast forward, then stop, rewind a bit, and basically listen for the silent gaps between songs. How did the CD-ROM drive actually know exactly where it was on the disk?
This is yet another massive legacy of the music industry. On a CD, Every single block of data, which holds 2048 bytes of actual user data, has a header attached to it. And stored inside that header is an absolute time address. It uses a format called binary coded decimal, or BCD, to store the exact minutes, seconds, and block number.
So it's literally using time as a physical map. The computer isn't saying go to sector 5000, it's saying go to minute 4, second 12.
Exactly, because it was built for audio playback. If you are sitting at home and you want to jump to the third song on a Pink Floyd album, the player is technically jumping to a specific time code on the disk. They just kept that exact same logic for the computer data. Go to minute 4 just happened to contain a spreadsheet file now instead of a guitar solo.
That is such a cool example of skeuomorphism, where a design feature from an older system carries over into the new one, even if it doesn't strictly make logical sense anymore for the new medium.
Yeah, it's a bit quirky, but it works flawlessly. Gave every single microscopic sector on the disk a unique, permanent, time-based address that the laser could seek out in milliseconds.
So, okay, the technology is incredibly impressive. The PC interface is highly accessible. But now we have to talk about the barrier that wasn't technical, the barrier that was purely financial.
Yes, the cost. This is where we really have to adjust our 21st century eyes. Because when we hear the word CD-ROM today, we think of something incredibly cheap, something you used to get for free in a cereal box or attached to the front of a magazine.
But Groves lists the actual prices from 1985. An audio CD player, just the standard unit for listening to music, retailed for about 200 to 300 pounds.
Which, if you just hear the words 200 pounds, sounds fairly manageable, maybe a bit pricey for an appliance, but okay.
Yeah.
But we have to actively account for inflation to understand the real impact.
The silent killer of historical pricing.
Right, so if we adjust that 1985 price to our context in 2026, that 200 to 300 pounds is roughly equivalent to 785 to 1,180 pounds today.
Over 1,000 pounds for a device that just plays music.
And remember, Groves points out that the CD-ROM drive designed for a computer was expected to cost a similar amount or potentially even slightly more because it required stricter error correction and an interface card. That is a massive financial investment for a home user. That's the equivalent price of buying a very high-end graphics card or a complete mid-range laptop today, just for the storage drive alone.
And then there's the cost of the media itself, the actual physical discs. Grove says standard audio CDs were selling for around 10 pounds each at the time.
Again, 10 pounds sounds cheap to us. Oh, a tenner for a new album, no big deal. But in today's money, adjusting for inflation, that 10 pounds is roughly 39 pounds today.
40 pounds for one single album. No wonder we treated them like absolute gold back then. I remember my dad having those special velvet cleaning kits and the little jewel cases. You didn't just toss a 40-pound disc onto the passenger seat of your car.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
You treated it like fine china. It was a serious investment.
But here is where Groves lays out what we would call the value proposition. Yes, 39 or 40 pounds is very expensive for a quote-unquote disc if you are comparing it directly to a single floppy. But if you think about it purely in terms of total capacity...
That's the key calculation he makes. If a blank floppy disk cost about 1 pound back then, which was roughly the going rate, and it held 360 kilobytes to get 540 megabytes of total storage using floppies, you would need to buy 1,500 of them. That would cost you 1,500 pounds.
So buying a 40-count CD-ROM is actually an incredible steal.
It's the bargain of the century. It's over 97% cheaper than the magnetic alternative.
And because of this math, Groves predicts that this immense capacity will allow software manufacturers to put all of their applications onto a single disk. He lays out this kind of all-in-one fantasy list in the article.
I really love this list. It's a perfect time capsule of who the big software stars were in 1985.
He literally says a single CD-ROM could easily hold the CP/M operating system, MS-DOS, including the full BIOS, the WordStar, word processor, SuperCalc, plus compilers for BASIC, Pascal, C, and Fortran.
Yeah, and he says it could also hold the entire text of Shakespeare. He just couldn't resist throwing Shakespeare in there to prove his point.
But think about how radical that vision was. The idea was that you wouldn't go to the store and buy a heavy cardboard box containing one piece of software on 5 floppy disks. You would buy the software disk. It would contain absolutely everything you could possibly need to run an entire business or a university department, all on one piece of plastic.
It was a very early vision of software bundling that we never really saw happen in exactly that utopian way, mostly due to copyright and competing companies. But the raw potential of it was undeniable. If you tried to carry all those specific programs on 360K floppy disks, you'd be lugging around a literal briefcase. Here, it's one disk in your shirt pocket. It completely rewrites the logistics of the entire software industry.
But as with all early tech, there was a catch, a very big catch, and it's hiding right there in the acronym, CD-ROM.
Read-only memory.
This was the fundamental flaw that Grove spends a lot of time pointing out. You cannot write to these disks.
And we have to understand that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience for users. It completely broke the way fundamental computer software worked at the time.
Explain that for us. Why did a read-only disk break existing software?
Well, think about how a program like WordStar functioned in 1985. Back then, software didn't assume it was running on a complex, protected operating system with separate hard drives. When you opened a file, or even just booted up the program, the software inherently assumed it could write temporary files or save configuration changes directly back to the exact same disk it was currently running from.
Right. It assumes the floppy disk is a two-way street. I load the program from here, and I save my user settings back to here.
Exactly. In programming terms, the basic command to open a file usually implied, open this file for reading and writing. But on a CD-ROM, if the software tried to write even a single byte of data back to the disk, it would hit an absolute brick wall. The drive physically cannot record. It's a laser player. It is not a laser burner.
So if your word processor tries to autosave a temporary backup file to the CD, the whole thing just crashes.
Instant crash. You'd get a write error or a read-only file system fatal error.
So the software developers suddenly had a massive architectural problem on their hands.
A huge problem. They had to go back and rewrite the core code of their applications. They had to explicitly tell the software, okay, you can read the main program files from this massive, shiny optical disk, but if you need to save a temporary file or save the user's actual document, you have to look over there to that magnetic floppy drive or that tiny hard disk and put it there instead.
It essentially forced a strict separation of program data and user data, which is something we completely take for granted on modern operating systems, but it wasn't standard back then.
It wasn't standard at all. It ultimately forced much better coding practices across the industry, honestly. But in 1985, for a developer trying to port their app to CD-ROM, it was a major, expensive headache.
And the specific limitation, the read-only nature of the physical media, actually dictated what kind of information was even suitable for CD-ROMs in the first place. Groves makes a very important distinction in the article between what he calls dynamic databases and static databases. This really stuck out to me.
It's a crucial concept. It's basically the fundamental difference between a daily newspaper and a bound history book.
He defines dynamic data as things that change constantly. He uses the example of inventory control for a business.
Right. If you are running a large supermarket, your inventory database changes every single minute, every time someone buys a can of beans at the register. If you try to put your master inventory on a CD-ROM, it is completely out of date 5 minutes after you press it at the factory. You can't update it. You would literally have to press and ship a brand new plastic disc every single morning.
Which is incredibly inefficient and expensive.
Totally unworkable. But static data, that is exactly where the CD-ROM absolutely shines.
Groves lists some really great examples of static data. Criminal law records, the Bible, the complete works of Shakespeare, map grid references, the geographical locations of airports.
Information that is fixed in time. Human history doesn't change. The text of Hamlet doesn't suddenly update with a new patch. The physical latitude and longitude of Heathrow Airport mostly doesn't change. For this specific kind of heavy text-based data, the CD-ROM was the perfect vessel. It wasn't just a disk. It was a physical library.
And this observation leads to one of Grove's most fascinating industry predictions. He predicts a massive shakeup in who actually creates and publishes computer software.
Yes, he does. He sees a major industry convergence coming over the horizon. He predicts that the financial interests of traditional software coding houses and traditional print book publishers would inevitably merge.
He specifically names two major players in the article. He says Macmillan and McGraw-Hill, and it's worth noting he actually spells it McGraw with an A in the source text would step in.
He predicts they would emerge as the major software publishers of the next decade. And history proved him largely right. Think about the golden age of the CD-ROM in the 1990s. Who was publishing those massive interactive encyclopedias?
Well, you had Microsoft and Carta, but if you look closely, that was actually based on the text of the Funk and Wagnalls printed encyclopedia. And of course, Encyclopedia Britannica had their own massive CD-ROM sets.
Exactly. All the rich educational software, the reference libraries, the medical databases, these all originally came from the traditional print publishing world. They already owned the vast mountains of content.
Mm.
The text, the commissioned photos, the detailed maps, they just desperately needed a cheap, high-capacity medium to distribute it digitally. The CD-ROM essentially allowed giant book publishers to pivot and become incredibly profitable tech companies almost overnight.
It really hammers home that this was a totally new medium. It wasn't just more storage for my spreadsheets. It was an entirely new paradigm for publishing human knowledge.
And he powerfully contrasts this new localized CD-ROM model with the only other viable way of getting large amounts of digital information at the time, the modem.
He'll dial up remote databases.
Right. In 1985, if you were a lawyer and you needed to search through a massive legal database like LexisNexis, you had to use a 1200 baud modem to dial into a giant corporate mainframe halfway across the country.
Yeah.
And you paid for that access by the minute.
And I'm guessing that wasn't cheap.
It was astronomically expensive. You literally had junior lawyers sweating bullets while they typed in their search queries because every single minute they were connected was costing the firm real dollars. It was a slow, stressful process, and the financial clock was always loudly ticking in the background.
But the CD-ROM offered a completely localized, offline alternative to that stress. You buy the master disk once made, it costs 500 pounds up front, but then you physically own it, it sits on your desk, you can search it for 5 minutes or 5 hours, you can let the new intern practice searching on it all weekend without bankrupting the entire law firm.
It democratized access to big data. You no longer needed a massive corporate account and an active telecom connection to a mainframe. You just needed the plastic disk in your local drive. It literally put the search power of $1 million mainframe right onto the cheap particle board desk.
So, okay, we have the massive capacity, we have the standardized 5.25-inch format, but there's one more massive technical hurdle that they had to solve to make this completely viable for the computer industry. And it's the reason why a random physical scratch on a CD doesn't immediately ruin your entire day.
Ah, yes. We have to talk about the secret sauce. Error correction.
Groves dedicates a section to the vulnerability of optical media. He compares it directly to the older magnetic media. And at first glance, this is a bit counterintuitive because we usually think of floppy disks as being incredibly fragile.
Well, floppies were fragile in a magnetic sense, yes. If you put them near a speaker magnet, they died. But in terms of actual data density, they were pretty sparse. The magnetic bits were physically large, so a random speck of household dust landing on a floppy disk might not actually cover up any critical data at all. Groves notes that the baseline error rates for magnetic disks were around 1 in 10 to the power of 9, which is about 1 error in a billion bits. That's pretty robust for the time.
But if you did happen to get a bad sector on a floppy, you got hit with that infamous DOS message. Abort, retry, fail.
The absolute nightmare message usually meant your data was just gone. But if you compare it to cassette tapes, it was even worse. Tapes suffered from audio dropouts, constant tape hiss, mechanical speed variations. Groves flat out says that the official data integrity policy for cassette tapes was essentially keep your fingers crossed and hope it loads.
I vividly remember loading text adventure games from cassette tapes on my old Commodore. You'd sit there listening to 20 minutes of awful electronic screeching noise,
Right.
and then right at the end, it would just crash. And you'd have to rewind and start the whole 20-minute process over.
Exactly. It was miserable. But with optical media, the physical risk profile is completely different. The data density is so unimaginably high. Remember, we established those tracks are less than a micron wide, that a tiny, everyday physical imperfection is a total disaster. A microscopic bubble in the plastic resin coating. A single tiny speck of dust. A smudge from a fingerprint.
To the microscopic laser beam, a tiny speck of dust isn't just a speck. It's a massive boulder blocking the road.
It's a mountain, completely obscuring the view of the data pits. And because the data is packed so incredibly tight that one mountain of dust covers up thousands and thousands of sequential bits, it completely obliterates them from the laser's vision.
So if you just recorded the data in a simple line, byte 1, byte 2, byte 3, byte 4, and a physical scratch happened to cover up bytes 3 and 4, they are just permanently gone. You can't ever get them back. The digital sentence is permanently incomplete.
So how did the engineers solve this fatal flaw? Because they knew CDs would get scratched. Groves explains the solution, which he calls redundancy with interleaving.
Redundancy with interleaving. I mean, it sounds like a complex military communication strategy. Break that down for us. How does it actually work?
It is a brilliant, brilliant mathematical concept. It happens in two parts. First, you have redundancy. This is the easy part to understand. As the disk is being mastered, you simply record each word of data multiple times. You bake backup copies of the data, right there onto the disk itself.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I lose the primary copy of the data, I just use the backup copy. Simple enough.
But that simple redundancy isn't enough on its own. Because if the physical scratch on the disk is big enough, it will likely wipe out the original data and the backup copy if they are sitting right next to each other on the track.
Right. If I hide my spare house key right next to my main house key on the same keychain and I lose the keychain, I still lose both keys. It defeats the purpose.
Exactly. So that brings us to the second, much more complex part. Interleaving. This is the absolute genius move. You take all those redundant words of data, and instead of writing them sequentially, you actively scatter them. You mathematically shuffle them all around different physical areas of the disk.
Can you give us a real-world analogy of how interleaving works?
Sure, let's try this. Imagine I need to send you a very, very important written letter through the mail. But I know for a fact the mail delivery trucks in my town frequently catch fire, or they just get completely lost.
Okay, a hostile delivery environment. Got it.
So first, I make 2 exact photocopies of my letter. That's our redundancy. But instead of putting both copies into one single envelope and mailing it, I take a pair of scissors and I literally cut the letters up into individual words.
Wait, you're shredding the letter.
I'm systematically disassembling it, yes. I put the first word of the letter into envelope A, I put the second word into envelope B, and then this is the interleaving copy. I take the backup copy of the first word and I put it way over in envelope Z. And then I mail all 26 envelopes on completely different days using completely different mail trucks.
I see. So you are physically scattering the underlying message across time and space to minimize the risk of a single catastrophic event.
Exactly. Groves describes it in the text as the redundant words being scattered over nearby, but not adjacent to parts of the disk. So now, imagine that inevitable scratch finally happens on the CD. That's our mail truck catching fire. It completely destroys envelope A. Word 1 is totally obliterated.
But envelope Z?
Envelope Z is physically located 3 centimeters away on the spinning disk. The scratch didn't even come close to touching it. So as the drive reads the disk, its internal processor realizes, uh-oh, word 1 is missing. It instantly reaches into its memory, grabs the backup copy from the Z location that it read a fraction of a second later, and flawlessly slots it right back into the proper place in the digital sentence.
And does the computer or the user sitting at the desk even know that any of this frantic reassembly just happened?
Not at all. The CD drive uses a dedicated internal buffer memory. That's where those cheap TTL chips come in handy to hold the scattered pieces and reassemble the puzzle in real time. It only presents the completely perfect, mathematically verified, reassembled data to the PC. The user is completely blind to the chaos happening at the laser level.
So the music doesn't skip. The complex spreadsheet doesn't crash. It all just magically happens in the background.
It's entirely seamless, and the statistical results of this interleaving technique are just staggering. Groves reports in the article that Sony claimed their hard error rate for CD-ROMs was 1 × 10 to the power of -12.
Okay, 1 × 10 to the -12. That is an unimaginably small number.
It is. So Groves helpfully provides a so what visualization for the reader to grasp it. He says that specific error rate is mathematically equivalent to finding exactly 1 wrong letter in a text 20 billion words long.
20 billion words.
Yeah. To put that completely into perspective, the entire printed Encyclopedia Britannica is roughly 40 million words long. So you could stack up 500 complete sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you might expect to find 1 single typographical error in that entire massive pile of books.
That is, for all practical human purposes, utter perfection.
It meant that these optical CD-ROMs were actually vastly more reliable than the magnetic floppy disks they were designed to replace. It wasn't just a revolution of offering more storage, it was fundamentally safer, more permanent storage.
So looking out through his 1985 eyes, having analyzed the massive capacity, the interface, the economics, and the error correction, Groves draws some final conclusions at the end of the piece. He really sees mass storage finally escaping the expensive domain of the corporate mainframe and arriving on the home user's desk.
Yes, he talks about the imminent arrival of what he calls turnkey systems. He genuinely imagines lawyers, doctors, and research scientists suddenly having access to massive, life-changing databases right at their local desks. And history shows this really did happen almost exactly as he predicted. The legal and medical professions, specifically, were completely revolutionized by CD-ROM distribution in the late 80s and 90s. Instead of paying for a dedicated room full of expensive, heavy reference books, you just had a neat little stack of plastic discs next to your monitor.
But he also looks forward to the ultimate goal, which is the write-once dream. He correctly notes that the only real disadvantage of the CD-ROM format is its unwritability, but he casually mentions that engineering work is already well advanced on optically writable systems.
He was a little bit overly optimistic on the actual engineering timeline there. He enthusiastically speculates that we would see writable optical media hit the market in the next 2-3 years.
And when did we actually get affordable CD burners for our home computers?
In reality, CD recordable drives, the CDRs we all use to burn mix CDs, didn't become truly affordable for the average home consumer until the mid to late 1990s. So it took closer to a full decade, not 2 years. It turns out that the complex physics of safely burning a microscopic pit into a layer of chemical dye at home was vastly more difficult than just pressing physical pits into plastic at a massive industrial factory.
But his underlying vision was completely right.
Oh, the vision was spot on. He clearly saw that eventually human nature would demand that we burn our own lasers. We wouldn't be content just passively reading the data the big publishers gave us. We would want to create and archive our own massive databases.
So Groves confidently speculates that the next few years following 1985 would see a massive revolution in lowered bulk storage costs. And in that regard, he was absolutely dead right. The CD-ROM single-handedly drove the expected cost per megabyte of storage straight into the ground.
It fundamentally changed consumer expectations. Once a PC user got used to having 540 megabytes of space available for 40 pounds, paying astronomically high prices for tiny 20 megabyte hard drives suddenly started to feel deeply painful. It aggressively pushed the hard drive manufacturers to innovate faster, to get much bigger and much cheaper, just to keep up with the optical baseline. It essentially set a brand new psychological floor for the question: how much data should a computer actually be able to hold?
It's really amazing to think about this specific article just sitting there in a computer magazine in 1985. It's the 540 megabyte shockwave. At the time it was published, it was mostly just speculation. It was breathless rumors imported from hardware labs in Japan. But looking back at it now, Groves was essentially writing the exact blueprint for the next 15 straight years of global computing.
He really was. If you think about it, from roughly 1985 all the way until the widespread rise of broadband internet in the early 2000s, the physical CD-ROM was the primary vessel of digital human knowledge. It was exactly how we got our interactive encyclopedias, our massive video games, our bloated software suites, even the hardware drivers that made our printers work. It was the crucial bridge technology.
It bridged the agonizing gap between the degraded analog world of thorn and steel and the truly connected high-speed digital internet world we live in right now.
And it did it all with just a microscopic spiral of tiny physical bumps and a cheap little laser beam.
So we've unpacked the underlying physics, the intense hardware interface wars, the brutal economics of adoption, and the absolute genius of interleaving error correction. It's abundantly clear from reading Groves that the CD-ROM wasn't just a slightly bigger, shinier floppy disk. It represented a completely different paradigm for how humanity interacts with information.
It was arguably the very first time in computing history that we had, quote-unquote, too much storage space. We honestly didn't even know what to do with it at first. In the early 90s, developers just filled the extra space on games with incredibly grainy full-motion video and terrible, uncompressed voice acting just because the space was sitting there empty. But we eventually figured out how to harness it.
Before we sign off on this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought about all this. Throughout this analysis, we've talked about how Groves viewed the read-only nature of the CD-ROM as a major technical flaw, a severe limitation that needed to be overcome. And as an industry, we spent the next several decades trying to fix it, first with CDRWs, then with cheap USB flash drives, and now with the omnipresent cloud, where we can seamlessly edit and update literally everything we own instantly.
But there was a very interesting flip side to that constant updatability, isn't there?
Exactly. Back in 1985, having a purely static database on a CD-ROM meant that once that piece of plastic was physically pressed at the factory, the data was completely permanent. It couldn't be silently updated in the middle of the night by a server. It couldn't be retroactively altered or censored. If you have a physical CD-ROM encyclopedia sitting on a shelf from 1995 and you put it in a drive today, it still says exactly what it said the day it was printed in 1995.
That is very true. Today, we live in this era of constant, invisible cloud updates. Digital history can actually be rewritten on the fly. A news article or a Wikipedia page you read yesterday might contain completely different information today. Software features that you rely on can just disappear overnight, simply because a parent company decides to quietly remove them in a patch.
We live in a world defined by completely fluid truth and dynamic shifting data.
But the old CD-ROM, It was an unchangeable physical snapshot. It was a literal, indestructible time capsule of knowledge.
So the question I want to leave you with is this. Is there something inherently valuable that we lost as a society by completely abandoning the unchangeable physical static database? In our endless technological rush to make absolutely everything writable, editable, and instantly updatable from the cloud, did we inadvertently lose the historical stability of the read-only world?
That is a deeply provocative question. I think the permanence of a physical medium is something we only really value once it's completely gone.
Yeah.
We have this collective assumption that the internet never forgets, but the reality is the internet changes and decays constantly. Links die, servers go down. But a physical CD-ROM sitting in a jewel case on your desk never, ever changes.
So that's something to think about the next time your favorite app forces an auto update and moves all the menu buttons around on you. You might just find yourself missing the simpler days when a disk was just a disk and the information on it stayed exactly that way forever.
When a 540 megabytes honestly felt like absolute infinity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into our laser-etched past. Keep those lasers spinning.